Good evening. On behalf of the Executive Committee of the Oxford and Cambridge Society of India, I welcome you all to today's event. We are honored to welcome Mr. Ravi Boothalingam, who will be speaking on a topic that is very relevant in today's geopolitical environment, India and China taking the long view. Mr. Boothalingam, a former OCSI president, holds a BSc Honours in Physics from St. Stephen's College and an MA in Experimental Psychology from Cambridge University, as also an AMP from the Harvard Business School. His 32-year career in industry in India and abroad includes stints as president of the Oberoi Group of Hotels, head of personnel worldwide with BAT PLC London, managing director of VST Industries Limited, Hyderabad, and director of ITC Limited, Kolkata. Mr. Boothalingam has served as an independent director on several corporate boards. Currently, he is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society London, honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies Delhi, and on the editorial boards of the China Report and World Affairs. He serves on the board of governors of the Global Risk Management Institute, Gurgaon, India, and is a member of the China Core Group of the Confederation of Indian Industry. Mr. Boothalingam is founder and chairman of Manas Advisory, a consultancy practice which focuses on top management coaching, integrating psychological science with on-ground management experience. He was encouraged by famed scientist and sinologist Joseph Needham in exploring psycholinguistics, a scientific method in Chinese culture. Mr. Boothalingam undertook an extensive Mandarin language program in China and has traveled widely in that country, including in its peripheral regions of Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. His perspective on China has been further enriched by travels in Japan, Mongolia, Russia, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, and Thailand. Following the talk, Mr. Boothalingam will answer audience questions. Please send your questions using the chat function at any time during the talk. I now request and invite Mr. Boothalingam to begin his talks.
Thank you, Bharat, and thank you, Siddharth. I'm very honored and privileged to be invited to give this lecture, and happy to see so many friends from all over the world. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I must also congratulate the executive committee on maintaining a very active program during the past 21 months, which have certainly not been easy for everyone. So, and I wish you the best going forward. So today, this topic is India and China taking the long view. And this title is drawn from a conversation that I had with Joseph Needham in 1966, when he had just taken over as master of Cornwall and Keyes College. By then, of course, he was already an eminent and very well-known scientist, one of the youngest to be nominated as a fellow of the Royal Society. And he had also gained prominence as a famed sinologist, even at that time, having completed 7 volumes of his monumental work, Science and Civilization in China, which ultimately grew to 28 volumes. It's the largest work in the English language, even surpassing Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So he was at that time more a sinologist than a scientist, but he took particular interest in those who had come up to read natural sciences as I had. And I was one of the very few students from east of Suez. There were only 3 of us, if I can remember. And I was the only science person. So he used to invite me to the Master's Lodge and talk to me about his projects and show me his beautiful collection of Chinese artifacts and landscape paintings. I was not terribly interested in all that. I think my attention was focused more on the wonderful sherry that he served, which he was very generous with. So I really didn't pay attention to a lot of what he said, which I regret today. But one conversation stands out, and this was in the early days of term when he told me, he said, Ravi, 4 boys from China are coming to join Keys. These are the first students from Red China, as it was, who have come to Cambridge after a gap of many years. I've got them here on some deal or the other, I forget what it was. And he said, look, why don't you show them around, take them, show them where things are in college, the shops, the pubs and everything. And I said, Professor, look, do you think this is really appropriate? Because if you remember, we fought a war against these chaps just a few years ago. And then he told me those words, which I still haven't forgotten. He said, Ravi, my boy, you must learn to take the long view. In matters concerning India and China, always take the long view. So that's what I thought would be appropriate for this talk. And I hope the long view is not too long for all of you gathered together. I will keep it within the time frame that I agreed with Siddharth and Bharat. So let me start by saying that what exactly did Needham mean by this? I couldn't figure it out then, and I got a hint only very many years later when I met him in Cambridge. He was he was ailing then, so he was not able to speak very well. He was a sufferer of Parkinson's during his last years. All he said to me was, if two great civilizations like India and China cannot sort out their problems, then I fear for the future of the world. And he really didn't elaborate very much beyond that. So that left me just that little much more wiser, but by not a great deal. So let me start with the ancient civilizations part of it. Of course, everybody knows the great connections between India and China. It's much talked about, not so much nowadays, but was in earlier days. But there is a lot of romance around this also. I think we must be realistic. And what modern history has shown is that whether you're part of one civilization or not part of that, it hasn't stopped the most disastrous of wars happening. The history of Europe over the last 500 years is testimony to that. People from the same Judeo-Christian traditions, from the same kind of cultural, linguistic, and other traditions, Greco-Roman traditions, have fought savagely during this period. On the other hand, completely opposite civilizations have been very friendly. I mean, we forget that America and China were great friends ever since American independence, right up to the time Mao Zedong took over. And they collaborated and fought a world war against a third power, Japan, which Huntington classifies as yet another civilization. So one Asiatic and one, what shall I say, European civilization fought another Asiatic one. So there are all kinds of these mix-ups in history. So I think the ancient civilization bit, though it has a lot of lessons, and I'll come to that in a minute, should not blind us to the fact that that does not stop effects of modern nationalism. And so let me now come more to the time nearer our own time. And I'm going to cover 4 dimensions of the India-China connection. The first dimension, and I'm ordering these dimensions in ascending order of importance. The first dimension is the boundary question. Now, you might be surprised that I'm keeping this as number 1. And remember, I said ascending order of importance. That doesn't mean the boundary is not important. What it means are 2 things, that there are other issues which are actually more important, in the sense that if they are sorted, the boundary will get sorted. And secondly, I make a distinction between what is important and what is urgent. And I'll come to this right at the end of the talk when we talk of actual actions that both India and China can take. So about the boundary, the first thing I want to say is, going back to the ancient civilizations era, no boundary was known at that time. The concept of a boundary is very, very new. It dates back about 200 years. It doesn't even go back up to the time when nation states evolved in Europe in the middle of the 17th century. It's later on, with the advent of modern map making, cartography, institutions like the Geographical, Royal Geographical Society, and so on. And that led to the concept that my sovereignty comes up to this particular line and it's 100% till there, and your sovereignty starts just an inch after that and is 100% and goes all the way up further. So this is a very new concept, and it's linked to the whole concept of nationalism, the nation being a territory, bounded, and so on and so forth. And in the case of India and China, this feeling started even before we became modern nations in today's sense of the term, India in 1947 and China in 1949 respectively. When the Asian Relations Conference was held in Delhi in early 1947, this was when the nationalists were still in power in China and the empire was still in charge here. There were tensions brewing at that conference about the question of Tibet. So this feeling of nationhood had started even before the 2 countries became nations. And this is very important because as a civilization, as a civilizational construct, India and China were all multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-tribal, multi-everything. Civilizations really had, as I said, no hard boundaries, and their border regions tended to grow and shrink with time. I mean, there was a nomadic raid, and they came in, and then they were repelled, and the empire bounced back, so on. So whether it is the Ottoman Empire, Chinese, the Mughal, or the Russian, this was the practice in those days. But with the coming of nationalism, you had this concept of the hard boundary. And with that hard boundary came the associated concept of them and us. That we are A, B, C, D, E, and they are G, H, I, J, K, different folk. And that has meant a certain constriction in the kind of curiosity about others that was prevalent in the civilizational period. Whether it was Ibn Battuta traveling in India, or the Chinese traveler Xuanzang in India, or the Indian Kumarajiva in China, or Marco Polo, those travelers at that time had a lively sense of curiosity about the places they were traveling to, their people, their cultures, and so on. What nationalism has done is, to a certain extent, confined and restricted this curiosity. And I would like to say that in the case of India and China, nationalism has restricted this curiosity about each other much more than in the case of US China, Japan China, Korea China, Europe China, and so on. And this is quite interesting because, as we said, we had these wide-ranging connections from Buddhist times, but then it seems to have faded off and never got back to anywhere near that level, despite the fact that in the case of, let's say, Japan-China relations, they were always far more fraught, far more violent, with lots of issues than ever has been the case between India and China. The history goes back to Kublai Khan's attempted invasion of Japan, foiled by the famous kamikaze wind, and so on. So today, the United States, despite the battle of technology and the battle of COVID and so many other battles, has very vibrant trade, economic, cultural, scientific, and other contacts with China, as does Japan, as does ASEAN, as does Korea, Europe, and so on. One of the reasons I think India and China have this rather edgy kind of nationalism, and we in India don't appreciate this fact so much, is the role of the Opium War. The Opium Wars, which were three of them actually, which started in the 1840s and right up to the middle of that century, took place when the British Empire was at its height in India. And India was actually growing the opium, and it was being exported from India to China. And the Chinese were being asked to buy this opium under the doctrine of the protection of free trade. And this was because Britain did not have the silver to pay China for all the imports of tea, ceramics, and porcelain, and all the other things that were happening. So in the Chinese mind, India became associated as a subordinate power to Britain in the export of this narcotic. And this is a memory that many Chinese still have of India, which in our narrative is somewhat suppressed. You get to know the gravity of this only when you start talking to Chinese people. And I think this is one aspect which kind of has given this narrative an edge before even the two countries became nations in the way that we know it in 1947 and 1949. And the edge in India-China relations, therefore, greater order. The nationalism is of a greater order than all these other pairs, which I alluded to. And this has constricted the space, as I said, for curiosity, and curiosity in the modern age means people-to-people relations, tourism, scientific exchange, cultural exchange, sports, and all of that, which really brings people together. And this happened with all the other pairs I've talked about, but not with India. And the fallout of this kind of rather fraught nationalism, apart from yes,
disturbance coming. I think that is not your end. Sound.
No, I've not got anything on here.
Yeah, I can hear it, but now it's gone actually.
Now it's gone. We were a little concerned because it was disturbing some of us to hear you. That's all.
Yeah, now it's clear.
But
Okay.
it's gone. It's gone. It's gone.
Thank you.
Sorry to trouble you.
So I was saying that it's constricted the space in which all these other activities which take place between countries add to the total quality of relations, even if they have political and other problems and serious ones between them. And therefore, consequences being that it has led to a very negative image of each other in each country. And that is the legacy that we face today. There is one exception to this. Well, it's not quite an exception, but I'll mention it as an exception because I'm treating it as my point number 3. Point number 1, to recollect, was the issue of the boundary. Point number 2, the issue of the nature of India-China nationalism. And point number 3 is economics. Now, when you come to economics, if you go back to history, and the economic historian Angus Madison has done a fantastic job of estimating what India and China's GDP was in previous centuries. And he said consistently for about 700 or 800 years, up to the 1800s, China was about 33% of world GDP and India was about 25%. And the others were bits and pieces. But after this period, around 1820, the opium trouble started in China, and British colonialism sort of rose to its heights in India. These ratios started declining. And by 1945 or so, they had come down to single digits, less than 10% in each country's case. When we both became nation states, the GDP of India was a little higher than that of China. And naturally, the GDP per capita of India was also higher because the Chinese population was higher. 30 years later, in 1979, China had caught up in its GDP, but its human development indicators had already surpassed India. Take a leap of another 40 years, which brings us just before the pandemic in 2019, and China's GDP by that time was 5 times the size of India's, and per capita as well, the same multiple. And by 2022, it's expected to be nearer 6 times. So this kind of difference from 1979 of near parity to a situation of 5x has also added, it's added both positively and negatively. It's added negatively to the strains of nationalism that I mentioned, because it's created additional anxiety in India. India sees itself as trailing. It's created a kind of somewhat an aspect of disinterest, if not disdain on the part of China for India. And China rather sees the USA as the country it should emulate, its main competitor, etc. And this has been the case for some decades. So this has added, as I said, to the strain of nationalism already imposed by all those other factors. But it's also done something else which is a positive, which is that on the economic front, India and China's interactions have progressed remarkably in the last 20 years. In the year 2000, the trade was only $2 billion. Now it's reaching $100 billion nearly. It's about 95 or 96 estimated for the current financial year. And this is despite the pandemic. This is despite Galwan. This is despite the restrictions, limitations, and other things imposed by our government and China in some cases. Trade has expanded manifold, investment has expanded, and overall, the economic trajectory has been markedly different from the non-economic trajectory. And why is this so? This is because China sees India as about 10 to 15 years behind its development curve, and therefore has been keen on taking opportunities available in India where it might, where the Indian track, if it follows the Chinese track, can help China achieve its economic goals, like in telecom, for instance, and so on, in automobile parts. That is what has played out. And the net result of that is the degree of interdependence between China and India has grown, but it has also been somewhat skewed in the sense that China matters to India more in terms of the economic relations than India matters to China. This added another layer of imbalance to the relationship. Now, this constellation of different aspects, when added to the aggravations and violence at the border that happened last year, has put India-China relations in a very unique situation. Unique in the sense that there is political antagonism, territorial face-to-face at the boundary, yet there is no declaration of war. Diplomatic relations are continuing. Economic relations are continuing, though there are some restrictions. But the most important point is that how does the economic trajectory for India, how should we look at it vis-a-vis China in the light of India's own national interest? This is what we need to examine. Now, when we look at India's own national interest and goals, what becomes very clear is that the transformation and prosperity of India and the Indian people have been the goals of every government of India from 1947 up to now. Whether it has been termed Garibi Hatao, or whether it's been termed New India and so on, whatever the terminology, the goal has been the economic and social uplift of all Indians. And that primarily has to be achieved by rapid economic growth. If there is no rapid economic growth, that target starts receding. So this is very, very important for India. And with the pandemic, with everything that has happened even before the pandemic and what is likely to happen later, it's very important to retain this goal of rapid economic growth. Now, that is not going to be very easy. One of our eminent members, Dr. Shankar Acharya, Keble, Oxford, has recently written a book where he has forecast that India's medium-term growth rate from 22 to 27 is only going to be of the order of about 5%. And that's a very sobering number. 5% is just not going to cut it, whether one is looking at the transformation of India for its own sake, for its own goals, or whether it is closing the gap with China. So we have to see very carefully how we can increase this number. And simultaneously, can we increase this number without engaging economically with China, despite the fact that we have all these problems with China that I just mentioned? This is the sort of dilemma that we are in now. Now, my own view here is that if we look at the economic relationship, as I said, China needs India for possibly less than India needs China because of the imbalance that I mentioned. But China also is not in a very easy position if you look at the slightly longer term. Aging society, a society with a lot of pent-up economic issues like the property bubble and all manner of stresses in its economy. So China also would be well served by not antagonizing countries more than it has already antagonized. And it has done its own share of that quite smartly in the last few years. So I won't dwell into that aspect very much more. I'll just mention that because I don't want to make this too long. But the main fact I want to come back to is that Indian economic growth of a rapid sort, say 8% plus, which is required to meet India's own goals, looks difficult to achieve unless there is engagement with China and larger Asia in a much bigger way than we have been able to achieve. Right now, about 44% of our trade is with Asia, including China. It's only 10 to 12% with the United States, and the rest is spread all over the place. And recent history shows, the last 10 to 12 years, the pattern of how trade has grown is that it's grown most with neighboring countries. I'm not talking of India, the general pattern. Trade has grown mostly with neighboring countries to start with, then with countries in the region, and lastly in a transcontinental manner. But that's not the case with India. India's trade with its neighbors is only 5% of our total trade. So it's really nothing. India's trade with the region is a little more respectable. As I said, 44% with Asia. And the rest is with the far-off regions. Now, this is the very opposite of what it is for Europe. I'm excluding Brexit now. Let's not get into Brexit, because that takes us into a different dimension. But Europe, as it was before Brexit, or East Asia, where China, Japan, Korea, ASEAN have a very, very close economic relationships despite all the tensions between them. So what this suggests for India is, one of the things we really need to do is to expand our trade and footprint, which also means our export footprint, with our immediate neighbors and with ASEAN and with China and with East Asia, as also the rest, but predominantly in these two categories, which are nearer us. And to do that, we have to join the trading blocks and the trading groups, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or its likely successor, the CPTPP, which is successor to the ill-fated TTP, which Trump abandoned. So unless India gets into these value chains, its capability of development will get stunted. So we have to do that. And that involves, again, bumping up against China, because China is there in all these groups. At the same time, China itself is a huge market. It's got something like 30% of world trade. It's reorienting its economy to achieve greater imports rather than greater exports, as it was the case in the older days. So there is a lot of opportunity for countries to sell their goods there. So for India, this is a time for export-led growth to penetrate the markets of our regional neighbors, the ASEAN region, China, East Asia, and of course the rest. And that's one way in which we could ratchet up our growth rate to a number 8% plus, which would be somewhat respectable. In fact, would get us near our objective of transforming our country, which is, as I said, the goal of every government so far. And it would also achieve another thing. As China has aging and these other issues and property hangovers and so on, its growth rate will slow as it has. Former Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramanian wrote an excellent book 10 years ago, in which he forecast this would happen, and his forecasts have stood up pretty well. He said China will grow at about 5%. And the Chinese government itself is talking down its growth rate in favor of what they call high quality growth. So unless India achieves this high level of growth, not only will our aspirations for their own sake not be fulfilled, but economic disparity with China will grow. As a result, economic disparity will add to the anxieties. On top of the anxieties to do with nationalism, and further on top of the anxieties to do with the boundary. And so it will become a negative spiral. So my proposition here is that India must engage economically with its region, near as well as medium. For that, it needs to become competitive. For it to become competitive, it will have to face and compete with the competition. It's somewhat like how we did at cricket early this year. I think it was the Brisbane Test, when our team was really in a shambles. The captain had gone, the injuries all around. And we felt, look, how is the team going to face this? They was going to throw in the towel, but they didn't. They went ahead and won. And really, if you analyze the reason for that, the reason is the IPL. Because IPL got Indian cricket to face competition, global competition. And a whole lot of talented young boys came up from the rural areas of India at that time in that environment and played against global competition and got that fire in their belly. So that's a sort of example I'm looking at. Rather than shying away from China or not joining these regional groupings, India has to take that step forward, ratchet up its growth rate, and therefore not only achieve its objectives, but narrow the disparity with China. Now, this poses a political problem, because now in this environment right now, where we are facing off in the border, this kind of suggestion is very difficult for anyone to really contemplate. So how can we look at this situation? How can one make this, as it were, politically more palatable? And here is a proposition I put to you in more as an inquiry and as a kind of joint search with you, which brings me to the fourth point, which might surprise you, which is climate change. We've just reached the end. I don't know whether it's the end. I haven't followed the news today. The Glasgow conference is perhaps still on. It was due to finish on Friday, but I don't know what's happened. But at the Glasgow conference, several things have become clear. One, I think we have seen probably that the era of climate change deniers is over. I think the most hardcore people, oil, the energy, the old industry, energy guzzlers, even they have come around that climate change is a real threat. And B, I think people have realized that time is short, action has to be taken, and rather than sign agreements and so on, we need to set concrete goals. And one of the encouraging developments I see in Glasgow is the coming together of the US and China on one platform and a joint statement being issued about working together on climate change, which is the first joint statement constructive. In fact, the first very joint statement, constructive as it is, which has come out of meetings between US and China for the last 2 or 3 years. And there are other positive signs. Our Prime Minister has set out some very bold targets for India in the shape of climate change. And India has done actually quite a lot in solar energy and so on. So why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this because if there is a consensus that climate change is a threat to humanity, and we can see this very clearly now, and it's not something right at the edge of the universe as it is, then possibly this can become a priority over local and nearer challenges. And the biggest actors in climate change are going to be China, US, and India. These are the countries that will have to make the biggest commitments and adhere to them. And when they adhere to them, this is going to lead to a lot of action, or has to lead to a lot of action. And that action will necessarily have to be cooperative. Because if they are non-cooperative, it makes a nonsense out of the whole climate change thesis. And if it makes a nonsense out of the thesis, then we are really in for a extremely bad time, because come another 50 or 60 years, there might be nothing left. So even if we solve our border and did all these wonderful things, if we end up in a kind of the climate change equivalent of a fireball, that's not going to be great fun. So the short point here that I want to make is that climate change could be a factor which might wake people up and say, look, here is a challenge which is larger than our other immediate rivalries, and perhaps we can set those aside while we tackle this biggie. And tackling this biggie will mean economic engagement, will mean scientific collaboration, which will mean teams going back and forth, which will mean greater not only economic relations, but greater people-to-people relations. So the effect that this might have will be to work back up that chain of importance that I mentioned to you: border, nationalism, economy, and climate change. Climate change being the more important. And then when you start engaging with the more important climate change, then you start realizing that the things you have to do to get that means you have to engage economically. So you come to item 3. And when you engage economically, you realize you have to have scientific cooperation and all these other things if you are to tackle items 4 and 3. And that kind of gets you into the nationalism box, where you had all these attitudes which were negative, and no cooperation and no travel and no scientific exchange and so on. So as it were, this, if this sequence happens, then the context becomes a little softer. It becomes a little more pliable for the competing nationalisms, i.e. India and China, to look at the boundary question afresh. Because the boundary question then, by that time, has become subsidiary to a much larger set of questions, which is planetary existence, the nature of globalization, the nature of sovereignty, and so on. Because things like climate change and pandemics for that matter, don't respect any borders or boundaries or sovereignties or treaties. They just happen. And if one doesn't have one's act together, these things can overwhelm us. And we've kind of been through an experience in the last 2 years which shows that you can come pretty close to the bone on this one, and get almost overwhelmed. So if this sequence happens, that brings me to my last and final point, which I said, is the question of urgency and importance. In the listing I gave you, the boundary was at the bottom and the others were on top. But I explained that that is by order of importance. And then I hope I have showed how, if you work backwards, you can then get to a stage where the border becomes more amenable to tackle. But the other dimension is one of urgency. And here I want to pay attention to the boundary, because there is one aspect to the boundary which is urgent. And that is the restoration of a peaceful and tranquil boundary. I think we are looking at what I would call a minimalist position here of just keeping the border quiet, peaceful, and free of incident, as it was for most of the time from 1962 until last year. No need to solve it, because that's going to be difficult in the light of what I've said so far. But if we can keep it peaceful and tranquil so that it does not aggravate the situation, then it is possible for us to proceed up the ladder of importance. But if we don't keep the border, and by we I mean both countries, of course, if we don't keep the border peaceful, that will be a very major distraction and will come in the way of progressing up this chain of nationalism, economic contact, and climate change cooperation, which will have very, very major consequences. So now I think it's time to get back to Needham and say that, as Needham foresaw, though he may not have foreseen this kind of ladder of consequences in these events, but I think he did foresee that it would take time. Time is something ancient civilizations understood. Both India and China have a very large concept of time, and they have also a very large concept of humanity. I think the slogan Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is a family, is a Sanskrit proverb which our Prime Minister related in Glasgow. The Chinese have a similar concept called Tathong, that is common humanity or common community. And this is where I think that Needham's insight probably can help in tracing the trajectory and in solving our problem, though I rather fear, as I said, it's not going to be immediate. It is going to take a while. Thank you for your patience in listening to me, and I hope you will have some questions. I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boothalingam, for a very insightful perspective. You've laid out a very interesting framework for thinking about the India and China issue or relationships between the two countries. I just want to pause and ask Siddharth, would you want to go and deliver your closing remarks before we turn to the questions?
Yes,
questions have started coming in.
I won't, I think the questions will be far more interesting. So I have my 2-bit which I have to say, and I'd rather say it and not let the flow of questions and the answers be interrupted at all. Mr. Boothalingam, thank you so very much for doing this. I don't think I have ever shared this with you, but you are also the inspiration for the executive committee in the last time when I was vice president, now as president, in the scholarships program, because I remember how in your term you very generously supported the scholarship program, something which we look up to and we remember, and we're trying to follow in your footsteps. It's been a pleasure knowing you, sir. And I still have very fond memories, Ketki and I have fond memories of the wonderful trip who our friend and our past president, Sumant Dhamija, was also here on this conversation, had organized to China. And it was fascinating to see your interaction in China and the fact that you gave a speech in Mandarin. I still remember that. We probably got a much better dinner than we'd expected because of your wonderful speech in Mandarin. You've given us a very interesting perspective. And I remember when we talked about this, you told me the anecdote about how you chose the topic for today, taking the long view. And with two very ancient civilizations, you're right, time is something which is relative. We can't really perceive time as we humans perceive it. The Chinese have always taken the long view, and I think it is time for India as a nation to also look at the longer view, because as we look at a civilizational context, when we hark back to the fact that we are an ancient civilization, well, we must also look at the future and the present in the same manner. It's been very interesting to listen to you, sir. You bridge the historical with the contemporary, and the varied areas of India and China's engagement, and of course, disagreement that you spoke about, which is a great topic of conversation, especially these days. Whether the border issue, nationalism in the two countries, or perhaps even hyper-nationalism, economic relations, cultural issues, climate change. The fact is we have to coexist in a more logical, rational manner. In fact, last evening, I must tell you, speaking of this coexistence, keeping in view that there has been a lot of restriction on foreign Chinese companies and apps, there are now mechanisms where people are seeking out to try and replicate those processes or reach out and deal with those products and those services to indigenize them, so to speak, so that the Indian public doesn't necessarily lose out. At the same time, the sensitivities of legal issues and government relations are maintained. Whether it be Kublai Khan, and I've enjoyed reading John Mann's wonderful book on Kublai Khan. I don't know if you've had a glance at it or if you find it any good. And you've really opened up for us, sir, a precise yet very comprehensive overview of a very fascinating yet complex relationship. I think it's been one of the most fascinating talks that we've had, and we can see that from the kind of attendance we've had. We've not had this kind of attendance for a very long time. Thank you so much, sir, for being here. And we've got a little more time in our term left, and once we resume physical meetings, let me assure you, sir, that you will have to spare some more of your time because we want to engage on these and other issues much more. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Bharat, also. I'll leave the floor open now to Bharat and to you to take the questions. You'll have to excuse me because I have an official engagement and I may have to escape a little early. So please, everybody, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Siddharth. I really appreciate your remarks.
Okay, great. So, Mr. Boothalingam, questions have started coming in. You can see the first question. I'll just start with one from Dr. Salim Ali. relates to the boundary issue that you talked about. The boundary line between the two oldest civilizations in the world was drawn by McMahon. Did McMahon consult both the countries while drawing the boundary? Did he inform China about the boundary drawn? What are the impediments in formalizing what McMahon had drawn as border?
I think, when we look at the history of boundary lines, and this can be not only a Zoom talk, it can be a Zoom seminar, it can be a Zoom week-long conference, because there is a McCartney line, there is the Ardagh line, there are many lines which precede what McMahon did. And it was all part of what I call the cartographic expression of the fact that a line is what captures the boundary limit of sovereignty of one state, in this case, the British Empire. Now, of course, the Chinese side has contested this with its own maps from the Qing dynasty maps and all kinds of other agreements and so on. And they turn around and give a number of arguments as to why they don't accept this. And this argument actually forms the basis of the discussions between the parties, or most of the discussions between the parties, on the settlement of the boundary. And they are unable to agree because their premises and starting points are different. So what I'm trying to suggest is the very logic and rationale or need for a boundary should be questioned in a fundamental way, like the European Union did. When boundary more or less vanished. I mean, we know that Alsace and Lorraine were fought over for 100 years across three wars. Today, nobody even knows where Alsace is or where Lorraine is. So I'm not saying that India and China should form a union, but the boundary should ideally become irrelevant to the two nations in its practical dealings, as it was in civilizational days, when whether it was shepherds or marriage parties or educational parties or students or monks traveled across. But that will not happen until we get a new configuration, which is what I was talking about. But yes, we say this is what McMahon did. The Chinese list a number of documents from their side, and this is where the nub of the argument is on this narrow point.
Thank you. Second question from Vishnupriya Rajagaria. She says, speaking of the long view, what role can cultural diplomacy play to bridge the widening gap between India and China, citing any private organizations that are part of this effort?
I think both countries lost a lot of time in not doing this. I think this could have played a very, very strong role in the past with the relationships that we enjoyed. But with the nature of the India-China nationalism becoming more bitter, as I said, early momentum in this area was lost. And it is very difficult to regain that now because the basic climate does not support it. I think basically now the way out is to focus on a goal where people can agree that that goal is larger than our local issue at the border or between our countries, and kind of tackle that and allow time to pass and various things to happen before the boundary issue can be retouched. It's too sore, it's too traumatizing at the moment to keep tackling head on. We've tried this for 60 years and it's really not worked. So I hate saying this because I was a great advocate for people-to-people relations, cultural relations, and so on. But right now, can you imagine the fate of an Indian dance troupe in China or a Beijing opera in Delhi? I think it would not be a happy situation right now. I think we have once the onion is unpeeled, you have to kind of put it together in layers as it was peeled. So I think that process has to be organic and has to follow a certain sequence. I hope. I mean, I'm trying to keep the answer as short as possible, but I realize this might not be an entirely satisfying answer for you, because I can sympathize with where you're going with your question, Vishnupriya.
Thank you, Mr. Boothalingam. So the questions keep coming. Question from Neha Goyal. What positive lessons can India learn from China's phenomenal rise of GDP, leaving aside the dictatorial iron hand of the Chinese approach, and imbibe it in its own economic journey to achieve a better growth rate?
Well, I think Chinese reform started in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping, but they actually built on what Mao had done. And despite the horrors of Mao's Cultural Revolution and the earlier Great Leap Forward, Mao did achieve some very solid things, which became the foundation for Deng Xiaoping. And those solid things were 100% primary and secondary education up to what they call class 9. Secondly, a kind of fundamental, very basic healthcare system, barefoot doctors and all that, but rural clinics and kind of enough of a bare basic healthcare system to provide a level of nutrition and health to its population. And number 3, effective land reforms, which enabled land redistribution and generation of income for farmers from their farms once Deng Xiaoping introduced his reforms. So when he introduced reforms in 1979, China had a population which was basically educated, but well enough and educated enough to become factory workers, which they did. And the people in the farms earned enough from those farms because of the consumption generated by these workers. And these millions of workers were then transplanted from the farms to the factories and produced low-cost goods for the US, Europe, and the rest of the developed world. So they kind of cooperated, as it were, with their adversaries, the US and China, ideological adversaries, but economic partners in a way, cooperated to rapidly build up China's GDP, and China's GDP grew at about 9 to 10% for 30 odd years. Now, India may not be able to replicate that exactly, but if India follows export-led path by engaging with its neighboring countries, the ASEAN region, East Asian region, and the rest of the world, through competitive exports, then India can do far better in its growth rate than currently projected. India has the manpower, the size, and the scope, but it needs to have enough of a market. The Indian market, we all think it's big. It's not that big. As Martin Wolf of the Financial Times has written, the Indian market is not all that big because the per capita income is less than $3,000. So the size of the population that is demanding goods and services beyond the basic level is actually not all that much. But if India could produce for the whole of Asia and part of the rest of the world, it would be a different story. Investment would then flood in a big way, as it did with China. For that, we have to be ready to compete, and we have to repeat the IPL story on a grander scale on the geopolitical platform.
So there's a question about what role does Bhutan play in Sino-Indian relationship? It's from Priyanshi Chaudhary.
I think Bhutan has been a very deft, very discreet, is to be complimented for its handling. It's not been in an easy situation, wedged between the two largest countries in Asia. But since that is its geography, it has managed it extremely well. And I think the country which most fervently hopes that the India-China situation will be resolved is Bhutan today, because they are the two pending land boundaries that China has not settled. China has settled all its other land boundaries. So it's two land boundaries with India and China are pending, and its maritime issues, of course, A, with Japan, and B, with some of the South China Sea neighbors, remain to be settled. I would say I haven't really discussed this with any Bhutanese in the last few months, but I think they would largely support, I think, the trajectory that I've set out, that urgent to keep peace on the border, and then work towards common goals, allow those common goals to flow back into economic relations, trade, and then influence the course of nationalism to kind of diffuse it to an extent, at which time you are in the right frame of mind to address the boundary question.
Okay. And while we're talking about the neighbors, I had a question about Afghanistan and all the changes that happened recently. What role does China play in Afghanistan? It looks like they are interested in some of the infrastructure, such as managing the airport, etc. But what role does China play, and what impact does that have on India?
Well, China actually has been playing a larger and larger role in India's sub-region, whether it is Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and of course Pakistan, and of course I shouldn't forget Nepal. And Afghanistan is the latest addition to that list, though Afghanistan is not technically a neighbor of ours. But this has been an outcome of China's economic growth, its size, as I said, 5 times the Indian economy, and therefore its expanded capabilities. And our neighbors, being smaller, are engaging in a very rational, what I think is a very rational course for them, which is to play off India and China and get benefits from both. This is what we did in the old days of the Cold War, to get the best of both worlds. Any country which is in a situation between two large powers, that's what it will do. And I think Afghanistan is similarly kind of, it's there between Iran on one side, Pakistan on one side, Russia on the third side. It has its complexities. Afghanistan itself is a country with what I would say, it's still a country in the process of making. It's not as if Afghanistan as a nation-built state is a done deal. China is interested in the larger region, in the Central Asian region, for many reasons. Its natural resources, its potential to demand and be a market for Chinese products, for Chinese infrastructure, for the Belt and Road, and so on. And Afghanistan forms a natural corridor between Pakistan and the outreach to the Middle East and to Iran, with China already has several agreements. So China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and further to the west form a natural extension for China, just as the northern extension north of Afghanistan through Central Asia and to Russia is another branch to China. So China is certainly interested in Afghanistan, just as it is in not only in the bordering regions of India, but in expanding its economic footprint in other parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and even Eastern Europe now.
A question from Nandita Chaturvedi. You mentioned nationalism. Do you make a distinction between anti-colonial revolutionary nationalism that has created our identity as Indian, humanity, and narrow European nationalism? How do you make sense of nationalism as a reaction to colonialism and Western dominance?
Well, I think that the Indian nationalism and Chinese nationalism, if you look at the first part, the first maybe 30, 40 years of the last century, were actually what you described, anti-colonial revolutionary nationalism. In fact, Japan was also a part of that triumvirate, and Rabindranath Tagore, Sun Yat-sen, and others in the Indian national movement had great common ground at that time. And the narrative at that time was the resurgence of Asia, but not in a violent way, as you point out, Nandita, in your question. Tagore, in fact, said that the East must show the West the way. This was around the time that Mahatma Gandhi was asked this question, what do you think of Western civilization? And he replied, yes, that would be a great idea. So there was this thought that China, Japan, Korea, India, as Tagore calls it, the great lamps of the East, would come together and show the world a non-violent type of nationalism which is associated with the larger humanity. This was the Tagorean vision. But has that lasted? I think as time went on, the concepts of Western nationalism, more nation-bound, border-bound, me, they, you, I, that kind of nationalism has come to the fore, regrettably, but that is what has happened. In fact, what you describe as a revolutionary nationalism with humanity really would not be nationalism in the way I describe it. It would be something more like, you know, cosmopolitanism, globalism, call it what you will, because the nation state then comes in the way. And what we are finding now is the nation state getting in the way, whether it is climate change, whether it's the pandemic, whether it is indeed the digital world, because all these areas don't respect sovereignty and they don't respect boundaries. So if your fundamentals are based on boundaries, then how do you deal with these things? This is what we have to start figuring out. But nationalism has taken a regressive path. But that is regrettable, but I think we have to find our way back from that route that it has taken.
And thank you, Mr. Boothalingam. Probably last question from me about the economy. Maybe it's more to do with the Chinese economy. You talked about how the Chinese government may be trying to slow the economy down, maybe bring it down to a more sustainable level. But there are also signs that there are bubbles in the real estate. We've heard of Evergrande and the whole bond debacle there, and the exposure to the banking system, to the real estate. And it reminds me of the Japanese economy back in the 1990s. And it went into a very long period of almost no growth, which is called the lost decade in Japan. Is there any risk of something like that happening in China?
Well, China has these problems. The property, China has grown, despite everything that we talked about. China's growth has been very wasteful of capital. They have thrown money at stuff, and especially in the property market, just building stuff on and on. And because China is not indebted to external countries, China will not have the same outcome like the great financial collapse that happened in the last decade, because all this debt is really domestic. But it will have an impact on China, and it will slow down China. And I think that is why they are trying to talk down the growth, because this has been spoken of for a while, that it's been very unbalanced growth. They haven't had the political will to really clamp down on it, but now they are clamping down on it. And if a few companies go bust, I think they will go bust. I think too big to fail may not work in China. And they will take the pain. The growth rate will slow down. Apart from that, they've got other problems of aging and all the rest of it, pensions, which is going to reduce their growth. But when you have a base of $15 billion of GDP, what you need is higher productivity to ensure your growth, and that's what they are counting on. terms of innovation, artificial intelligence, robots and all that, to keep ratcheting up their productivity so that they don't have to throw capital at the problem. This is their hope. Now, whether they will really do it well enough is a question. I mean, they might start throwing capital at research and development, to ratchet up research and development, and that will be wasteful in its own way. And I think that habit is fairly strong in China, so I wouldn't be surprised if they do that. But they hope to get out of this through two things. One, low foreign indebtedness, and B, through innovation and robotics to make up for the manpower shortage that will undoubtedly arise.
Thank you, Mr. Boothalingam. And with that, we come to the end of this very interesting lecture. Thank you so much for taking the time and making us aware of this framework. I also thank all the audience who very patiently sat through this lecture. I'm sure we learned a lot from Mr. Boothalingam today, who very patiently also answered our questions. And with that, we come to an end to this evening. I hope to see you again at our next event very soon. Thank you.